Hello, my dear literature enthusiasts. I want to begin by saying how genuinely grateful I am that you've joined me here today. Whenever I sit down to share thoughts about a film, I feel as though I'm among friends, kindred spirits who don't merely watch movies for their explosions or their star-studded casts, but who instead seek something richer, something that resonates on a deeper plane, like a line of poetry that lingers in the mind long after the book is closed. If you enjoy our shared journeys into these thoughtful, reflective explorations, I'd be so thankful if you could like and subscribe. It helps this little circle of ours continue to grow and ensures that our conversations reach more curious hearts like yours. But let me be clear before we dive in. What follows isn't really a movie review in the traditional sense. Rather, it's a theoretical, critical analysis, an intellectual wandering through cinematic landscapes, crafted with an audience in mind who appreciates literature, metaphor, and the layered art of storytelling. So, let us begin with The Expendables 3, a film that, at first glance, appears almost allergic to subtlety. The very title suggests bravado and spectacle, and if one comes expecting a symphony of gunfire, explosions, and grizzled faces carved from decades of cinematic machismo, one won't leave disappointed. But for me, what made this movie worth dissecting wasn't the cacophony of bullets. It was the strange poetry hidden beneath that relentless action. I remember when I first watched it, sometime in the late summer of its release, the theater buzzing with fans, most of them craving only the nostalgia of familiar action icons. I, however, sat there with my notebook, as though preparing for a seminar, ready to scribble not just the moments of spectacle, but the emotional timbers, the archetypes, the curious interplay of myth and mortality that seemed to glimmer just beyond the explosions. That, for me, is where the true story lies. What struck me most in those opening scenes was the unapologetic indulgence in star power. Here we had a roll call of legends, faces that had defined entire decades of cinema, colliding together like mythological gods in a modern Valhalla. There is a kind of literary richness in watching them occupy the same frame, as though time itself had bent inward to allow multiple eras of storytelling to coexist. For a student of narrative, this alone feels like a case study in the evolution of archetypes. Heroes of the past now reassembled in the twilight of their glory, playing out one last great act in the theater of mortality. It reminded me of how epic poets would recount tales of warriors long past their prime, still clinging to valor, still refusing to relinquish the world to younger men. Perhaps this is why the film resonates with me personally. I often think about aging, about what it means to let go of one's moment in the sun, and about the complicated dance between yielding and fighting to remain relevant. The story itself, if one strips it to its bones, is one of transition. We begin with a team, battle-worn and resolute, called to face an enemy that is both personal and symbolic. Along the way, new blood is introduced, fresh faces who represent not just youthful energy, but the inevitability of succession. Watching this unfold, I couldn't help but recall my own experiences with teaching literature to younger generations. There's always that bittersweet moment when you realize your role isn't just to shine alone, but to prepare the space for others to shine brighter, perhaps even eclipsing you. In this sense, the film is not merely a barrage of stunts. It's a meditation, however rough and unpolished, on the inevitability of legacy. The plot, of course, is painted in broad, action-packed strokes. A mission goes awry, secrets are revealed, alliances fracture, and battles rage with relentless energy. Yet behind this, if you tilt your head just slightly, you can see the allegory at work. The antagonist is not merely a villain in the conventional sense. He embodies betrayal, the haunting shadow of history. He is, in a way, a projection of what happens when camaraderie decays, when brotherhood is poisoned by ambition. It's not hard to imagine Shakespeare writing such a figure, a warrior turned traitor, a ghost from the protagonist's past returned to mock him with a mirror of what he once was. The tension, then, is not just physical, it is existential. The old guard faces not only their enemies, but the terrifying recognition of time's erosion, of strength waning, of death encroaching. As the narrative unfolds, we are treated to a curious spectacle. The veterans stepping aside, if only temporarily, for a new generation to take the stage. These sequences, while perhaps less thrilling for those hungry for nostalgia, fascinated me. They spoke of cycles, of the eternal pattern in which youth rises, untested yet fearless, while the elders watch with equal parts pride and reluctance. It reminded me of the transitions within families, when the mantle of responsibility shifts quietly from parents to children, often without ceremony, but with immense emotional weight. There was one particular moment that pierced me. The hesitation in letting go, the flicker in the eyes that suggested a yearning to remain indispensable, even as the world insists otherwise. Who among us has not felt this? Whether in our careers, our relationships, or our passions, we all cling to the idea that the story cannot go on without us, even when, inevitably, it must. The film is not shy about its set pieces. Helicopters crash, bullets rain, buildings crumble, and entire sequences unfurl like operatic crescendos. And yet, for all its bombast, I kept returning to quieter reflections. To me, these explosions were less about spectacle than they were about punctuation. Each blast was a reminder of the fragility of flesh, of how swiftly life can be reduced to dust. Perhaps that sounds morbid, but literature has taught us that even the most outrageous violence can serve as metaphor, a symbolic tearing away of illusions. Beneath the fire, the smoke, the adrenaline, there's an elegy, an acknowledgement that everything we build, everything we fight for, is impermanent. This resonates with me on a deeply personal level, for I've often found myself caught between the rush of ambition and the quiet contemplation of impermanence. To see it mirrored in such a brazen film was, strangely, comforting. If I were to tease the key elements and major twists without unraveling too much, I would say this. The heart of the story lies not in its missions, but in its reckonings. The most memorable turns are not found in who wins the battle, but in who accepts their place within the ever-turning wheel of time. Betrayals sting, loyalties are tested, and friendships prove both fragile and unbreakable all at once. There's a twist, yes, in the revelation of the antagonist's identity and in the shifting alliances, but for me the greater twist was existential. That a film so loud, so unapologetically brash, could whisper such delicate truths about aging, legacy, and mortality. It is in these contradictions that art, even in its most commercial form, becomes worthy of intellectual exploration. What makes this experience linger in my memory is how it connects to my worldview. I have always believed that storytelling, whether in novels, plays, or films, is humanity's way of rehearsing for life's inevitable transitions. We tell stories of heroes not merely to be entertained, but to confront our fears, to measure our courage, and to soften the blow of reality. In this particular case, what resonated with me was the reminder that even the most formidable warriors, even the icons we believe indestructible, must one day confront their limits. And in doing so, they remind us, gently but firmly, that so must we. As I reflect on this film now, I find myself less concerned with its flaws, of which there are many, if one wishes to catalog them, and more attuned to the unexpected gift it offers. Like an old friend telling a story badly, but sincerely, it stumbles, it overreaches, it makes us roll our eyes, but it also reaches out to touch something essential. And for me, that is enough. It is enough to make me pause, to think, to feel, and to carry a little piece of its lesson into my own journey. So, my dear companions in this exploration, I invite you to watch it not as a mere action spectacle, but as an allegory, a modern myth draped in gunpowder and sweat. Approach it with the eyes of a reader, the heart of a poet, and the patience of a friend. You may find, as I did, that even within the most chaotic of battles, there lingers a quiet truth. That all of us, expendable or not, are bound by the same relentless passage of time, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is not in our victories, but in the wisdom we pass on. What strikes me right away about the film's beginning is its sheer audacity. There's no gentle lull, no patient introduction. Instead, it thrusts us directly into the chaos, as though the screen itself has been waiting impatiently for us to arrive. I remember the first time I watched it. The opening moments felt like being tossed into a roaring storm without even a chance to put on a coat. There's this momentum, trains rattling, sparks flying, steel grinding against steel, that carries an energy almost too big to contain. For me, that sensation recalls being a child sneaking into the living room while an older sibling played an action-packed video game at full volume. I wasn't part of the game, but the vibrations shook through me, and I could feel the story even without knowing all the rules. The film begins in a way that communicates immediacy. A rescue mission, staged in near-mythic proportions, introduces not only the physical stakes, but also the personalities involved. Watching this, I couldn't help but think about how Homer's epics so often begin in medias res, in the middle of things, forcing us to orient ourselves quickly to recognize the hero by their deeds before their names are even spoken. That's the feeling here. Explosions bloom like violent punctuation marks. Yet between the lines of fire there are small gestures. The way one character takes point, the other covers his flank, the unspoken trust between them. It reminded me of how, in friendships, sometimes entire conversations can pass without words, just through glances, through timing, through who steps forward first. The rescue itself unfolds with balletic chaos. Prison walls shatter, armored convoys thunder across tracks. And amid the shrapnel we sense both liberation and foreshadowing. This isn't just an extraction, it's a symbolic act. A comrade, long kept in captivity, is wrenched back into the fold. For me, this stirs memories of reunions in my own life. Not dramatic jailbreaks, of course, but those reunions where someone you thought lost to time suddenly reappears, carrying both joy and a sharp reminder of how much time has been missed. When the rescued man steps into the fray again, there's a flicker of triumph, but also a shadow. What has captivity done to him? Can he rejoin seamlessly, or will the scars linger? The film doesn't answer immediately. It lets the question hang in the air like smoke after a blast. As the story gathers itself after this adrenaline-soaked overture, we begin to see the group in a more grounded light. They are warriors, yes, but also weary souls carrying the sediment of countless battles. There's a brief lull, a chance to breathe, and in that stillness we glimpse their camaraderie. I find this portion oddly comforting. The way hardened men trade quips, tease one another, share food and drink. It mirrors the way people who've weathered storms together can find lightness even in heavy times. I've felt that with close friends after long nights of work or travel. Sitting quietly, joking, knowing the bond is sealed not in words but in the fact that you endured something together. But equilibrium never lasts long in stories like this. A new mission arrives, as missions inevitably do. What's fascinating is how it's introduced not as a straightforward task, but almost as a riddle. There's the promise of danger, the whisper of a formidable adversary, and an unease that permeates the air. It feels less like a job and more like a reckoning. When the leader of the group takes on this new challenge, we sense a shift in his eyes, a mixture of duty, pride, and that gnawing fear of what could go wrong. That feeling resonated with me deeply because it mirrors those crossroads moments in life where we're presented with an opportunity that is both irresistible and terrifying. A promotion, a new relationship, a leap into the unknown. There's the thrill of possibility, but also the weight of responsibility. The build-up to this confrontation carries a subtle elegance. The team prepares, gearing up in ways that feel ritualistic. Weapons checked, vehicles prepped, plans laid out with precision. And yet, as an observer, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Like when you step into a room and everything looks fine, but there's a faint draft or a flickering light that tells you all is not as it should be. This unease is deliberate. It primes us for the shock to come. And then, the confrontation. The enemy is revealed not as some faceless foe, but as a figure who jolts the entire narrative into a sharper, more personal focus. It is a revelation of history, one of those moments when the past suddenly erupts into the present, rewriting everything you thought you understood. I felt the impact deep in my chest. It reminded me of bumping into someone from my past unexpectedly, someone I thought I'd left behind, only to realize their presence still carried power over me. The clash here isn't merely physical. It's ideological, personal, even spiritual. The characters aren't just fighting for survival. They're fighting against ghosts. The battle that ensues is brutal, chaotic, almost suffocating in its intensity. Bullets rip through the air, steel collides, and amidst the carnage the leader makes a choice that changes everything. He pushes forward with courage, but it comes at a cost. The team, his brothers in arms, are wounded, broken, shaken. Watching this unfold, I found myself leaning closer, as though proximity would somehow protect them. It's in this stretch that the story confronts us with the truth that even the strongest bonds are fragile in the face of overwhelming force. The aftermath of this clash lingers heavily. The team is not victorious. They're fractured. The leader shoulders the blame, retreating into a kind of quiet despair. Here the film slows down, allowing us to witness his vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, I recognized something achingly human, the tendency to take on responsibility for things beyond our control, to shield others even when the burden threatens to crush us. I've done that myself in smaller ways. Apologizing for things I didn't cause, try to hold together pieces that were already broken. It's a deeply human instinct, born of love and loyalty, but it can also isolate us. In response to this failure, a new idea germinates. The leader begins to believe that perhaps the old ways, the old comrades, are no longer sustainable. Perhaps fresh blood is needed, unscarred by years of war. And so begins a recruitment sequence that is both exhilarating and heartbreaking. Exhilarating because it introduces new faces, young and daring, full of the kind of reckless courage that only comes with inexperience. Heartbreaking because in seeking them out, he implicitly distances himself from the ones who have been by his side all along. It's the paradox of renewal, the desire to protect what you love by replacing it. These moments of recruitment almost feel like auditions for a play, each new figure stepping forward with their own style, their own quirks, their own bravado. There's a playful energy here, a chance to catch our breath, but beneath it, I felt a quiet sorrow. Watching those younger faces, eager and untested, I thought about times I've met people at the start of their journeys, students brimming with ambition, colleagues new to a profession. There's joy in their vitality, but also a protective instinct, knowing how harsh the world can be, knowing the scars they haven't yet earned. As this portion of the story unfolds, we feel the weight of a turning tide. The old guard stands at the edges, uncertain, perhaps wounded in pride, while the new recruits step into the light. It's a transition, a passing of torches, or at least the illusion of it, because underneath, the question lingers. Can the untested truly replace the seasoned? Can youthful boldness outweigh experience etched into bone and memory? And just as this question builds, the story edges toward another confrontation. The mission looms larger, the stakes more dire, and though the new team brims with energy, I found myself uneasy. Like a teacher watching eager students rush into a challenge without realizing the complexity of what awaits. I wanted to call out to them, to warn them. But stories don't allow us to intervene. They only allow us to bear witness. By this point, the narrative has woven together triumph, loss, and renewal, creating a tapestry that feels both thrilling and poignant. We've seen loyalty tested, leadership questioned, and the fragile beauty of camaraderie strained under the weight of history. The first stretch of the story doesn't offer closure. It offers a question mark, a sense that the real reckoning is yet to come. And in that lingering uncertainty lies its power. When I paused here, during my first viewing, I remember staring at the screen and taking a deep breath. The adrenaline had subsided, replaced by a quiet dread. I thought about how stories often mirror our own lives, not in their specifics, but in their rhythms. We rush forward, we stumble, we pick ourselves up, we try new paths, sometimes abandoning those we love in the process. This film's early movements, for all their fire and thunder, carry that truth within them. They whisper to us about the weight of choices, the burden of leadership, and the impossibility of protecting everyone we care about. And so, as the story shifts gears and prepares to plunge us deeper into its crucible, we are left holding that tension in our hands. The exhilaration of new beginnings intertwined with the ache of what's been left behind. That, to me, is what makes these early chapters so rich, so layered, and so worth revisiting. Not just as spectacle, but as allegory, as reflection, as a mirror to our own fragile, determined selves. I still remember vividly the first time I reached this point of the film. I felt a mix of anticipation and dread, like reaching the midpoint of a long hike where the only way forward is through the most treacherous terrain. The early momentum had shifted into a sobering tension, and now, as the story pressed on, I realized the true confrontation wasn't just about bullets and blood. It was about identity, legacy, and the price of leadership. The new recruits, young and brash, had been assembled, and with them came a fresh sense of possibility tinged with arrogance. They dove into their mission with the bravado of those who believe they are invincible. Watching them, I couldn't help but think of my younger self, barreling into challenges with blind confidence, certain that sheer willpower would be enough. There's a bittersweet beauty in that stage of life. The ignorance of consequences, the belief that failure is impossible. But as literature so often teaches us, hubris is dangerous. And soon, painfully, inevitably, that danger manifested. The recruits' mission unraveled swiftly. Their inexperience, their lack of the hardened instincts of veterans, led them straight into a trap. It was one of those moments where, as a viewer, you want to leap through the screen, to warn them, to shake them into caution. But of course, stories don't bend to our pleas. The trap snapped shut, and with it came a heavy silence in the theater. A silence filled not with explosions, but with the suffocating weight of failure. The enemy, cunning and ruthless, captured them. Not just faceless villains, but the very adversary who represented the ghost of the past, the betrayal that had already scarred the team's leader. This was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a psychological ambush. To see the new blood imprisoned, their bravado stripped away, was to see the fragility of youth laid bare. It reminded me of my first real failure, the kind that stung so deeply it left an imprint on who I became afterward. I had walked into something thinking I could not lose, and when I did, it broke me open. That's the resonance here, the recognition that pain, humiliation, and loss are not just obstacles but crucibles. For the leader, this was the breaking point. He had thought replacing his old comrades with new recruits would spare them harm, that he could carry the burden of risk alone by choosing untested shoulders. But now, staring at the wreckage of that decision, the weight of responsibility nearly crushed him. His silence, his retreat into himself, carried the solemnity of a tragic hero. In literature, these are the moments when the protagonist withdraws in his solitude, wrestling not with external enemies, but with the guilt of their own choices. I felt that deeply. I thought of times when I'd made decisions that hurt those I loved, and how the desire to protect sometimes leads us to cause more harm. It is a paradox, and one that lingers like a bruise long after the scene fades. But despair, while heavy, does not hold forever. From the shadows of defeat, the old comrades re-emerged, not with reproach, but with loyalty. They refused to be cast aside, refused to let their bond dissolve in the face of danger. And this, to me, was one of the most powerful moments of the entire story. Not the explosions, not the gunfights, but the quiet persistence of friendship. I think we all need reminders like this, that the people who love us don't leave simply because we try to push them away. They wait. They return. They stand by us even when we stumble into foolishness. Seeing those weathered faces stepping back into the fight stirred something deep in me. It was like watching the return of old mentors in a novel, Those figures who refuse to fade, who remind us that our stories are intertwined whether we acknowledge it or not. From here, the story surged forward with renewed momentum. Plans were drawn, alliances formed, and a rescue mission set in motion. Yet it wasn't just about saving the captured recruits. It was about redeeming the choices that had led to their capture, about healing fractures in the group's unity. The rescue itself unfolded with both tension and inevitability, each movement carefully staged like a symphony building toward crescendo. The veterans' precision, their practiced ease, contrasted sharply with the recruits' earlier recklessness. It was a lesson written not in words, but in action. Experience tempers courage into something more enduring. When the two groups finally stood side by side, young and old united, there was a sense of wholeness, as though the fragmented pieces of the story had finally clicked together. It reminded me of family reunions after long estrangements, the awkwardness fading into laughter, the realization that despite differences, belonging persists. I've felt that personally, the relief of reconciliation, the quiet joy of knowing the bonds didn't break, only bent. And then came the true confrontation, the storm toward which everything had been building. The enemy, once revealed as a ghost from the past, stood as more than a man. He was a symbol, betrayal, regret, the shadow of choices made long ago. Facing him was more than combat. It was an act of catharsis. I could feel my heart pounding as the battle raged, not because of the gunfire, but because of what it represented, the reckoning with one's own history. The set pieces unfolded with operatic grandeur, buildings collapsing, machinery roaring, bodies colliding in fierce struggle. Yet what lingered for me wasn't the choreography of violence, but the emotional undercurrent. The leader, battered yet unbroken, fought not just for victory, but for redemption. His comrades fought not just for survival, but for one another. And in the chaos, the recruits learned the lesson that no training manual could teach, that bravery is not about charging forward recklessly, but about standing firm for those beside you. The climax reached its fever pitch in a one-on-one confrontation, the kind of duel that feels as old as storytelling itself. Hero against betrayer, loyalty against treachery, past against present. Every strike, every counter carried symbolic weight. I thought of epic poems, of knights and villains locked in battles where the outcome determined not just life or death, but the meaning of an entire narrative. Here too, the clash felt bigger than the men themselves. It was the collision of ideals, of who they were and who they refused to become. When the final blow landed, when the betrayer fell, there was no unrestrained triumph. Instead, there was relief, exhaustion, the quiet settling of dust. That felt honest to me. Life's greatest battles rarely end in euphoric victory. They end in weary exhalations, in the recognition that the struggle has taken its toll. The characters stood amidst the rubble, not as untouchable heroes, but as scarred survivors. And that, I think, is truer to life than any fairy tale ending. The resolution unfolded gently, almost tenderly. The recruits, humbled yet wiser, looked to their mentors with newfound respect. The veterans, once reluctant to yield, began to see the value in passing on their legacy, not as replacement, but as continuity. It reminded me of handing over books to younger students, books that had once shaped me, knowing they might carry the torch forward in ways I never could. There is a sense of acceptance here, a quiet acknowledgement that time moves on, and the best we can do is ensure what we've learned does not vanish with us. In the final moments, laughter and camaraderie returned, fragile but sincere. The story did not erase the scars of what had been lost, but embraced them as part of the whole. And as the camera lingered on these faces, some young, some weathered, I felt a deep resonance. It was a reminder that stories of war and action, no matter how loud, are ultimately stories of love. Love between comrades, between generations, between the self we were and the self we are becoming. When I left the theater after my first viewing, I remember feeling strangely quiet. The spectacle had been immense, but what lingered was the intimacy, The way it spoke to the inevitability of aging, the necessity of legacy, the endurance of bonds. I thought my own friends, my mentors, my students, and how we all weave in and out of each other's stories. And I realized that what mattered most wasn't the size of the battles we fight, but the people we stand beside while fighting them. That, for me, is the heart of the story's final act. Beneath the thunder, beneath the roar, it whispers of loyalty, redemption, and the bittersweet truth that while time may take much from us, it also gifts us the chance to pass on what matters. And in that act of passing, in that bridge between generations, lies the closest thing we have to immortality. The characters in this story arrive not as strangers, but as familiar silhouettes, archetypes shaped by decades of cinematic myth-making, and yet they carry within them subtle textures worth lingering on. To see them move across the screen is to witness a conversation between past and present, between ideals once lionized and the fragile humanity that now peeks through the cracks. They are more than action figures. They are symbols, metaphors in motion, breathing embodiments of themes literature has long grappled with: mortality, loyalty, betrayal, the cost of heroism. What makes the ensemble fascinating is not just their star power, but the way they orbit one another, each character defined in part by his relationship to the others. No man here exists in isolation. Each gesture, each decision, resonates against the backdrop of shared history, making the analysis of a single character incomplete without acknowledging the chorus around him. It's rather like reading the Iliad, where individual heroes shine brightly, but always against the collective canvas of the war. At the center stands the leader, a figure who embodies the paradox of strength and fragility. He is decisive, disciplined, the kind of man others instinctively follow. Yet beneath the hardened exterior lies a current of fear, not fear of death, but of failing those who trust him. This is his tragedy. He carries responsibility like a second skin, rarely admitting the toll it takes. Watching him, I couldn't help but think of King Lear in his later stages, a ruler torn between clinging to power and recognizing his own limitations. Like Lear, he makes choices that fracture his circle, pushing loyal companions aside in the name of protection, only to realize that isolation magnifies weakness rather than lessening it. His arc becomes a meditation on leadership itself, the burden of making decisions that will inevitably wound someone, and the slow, painful acceptance that no leader can shield everyone from harm. Around him cluster the veterans, each with their own texture of personality. They are a chorus of loyalty, humor, and grit, grounding the story in camaraderie. One might be jocular, using humor to deflect the trauma of violence. Another quiet, almost stoic, his silence carrying more weight than words. Together, they form a living memory, a tapestry of shared battles and scars. Their bond is unspoken, like the shorthand between lifelong friends who no longer need to explain themselves. Watching them reminded me of gatherings with old friends, where conversation flows not from novelty, but from familiarity, the way a single glance can summon decades of shared history. In narrative terms, they function as the embodiment of tradition, a reminder that experience and trust cannot be easily replaced. And yet, the story complicates this by introducing the recruits, those bright, untested figures who burst into the narrative with youthful arrogance. They are eager, talented, full of bravado. The sort of characters who believe danger is merely a test of daring rather than a crucible that burns deep scars. Their presence injects energy, but also creates tension, for they inadvertently embody the inevitability of generational change. Their leader recruits them out of both desperation and guilt, hoping to shield his old comrades by casting these new faces into the fire. But in doing so, he sets up a painful contrast, the raw potential of youth against the weathered resilience of age. I found myself thinking about my students when I watched them, so brimming with possibility, unaware of how merciless the world can be. The recruits are compelling not because they are perfect, but because their imperfections highlight the fragility of idealism when tested by reality. Among the younger group, each personality shines in miniature, though none carries the same mythic heft as the veterans. One is brash, overconfident, prone to leaping before thinking. Another is tech-savvy, analytical, a reminder that modern warfare has shifted from brute force to clever strategy. Their differences make them appealing, but also highlight the gap between raw skill and the hard-earned wisdom that comes only with time. When they fail, it is not because they lack ability, but because they lack scars. In narrative terms, scars are the truest teachers. The antagonist occupies a different space altogether. He is more than a villain. He is a mirror held up to the protagonist, a vision of what might have been. Once a comrade, now turned traitor, he embodies the darker side of ambition, the hunger for power, the refusal to accept limitation. In this sense, he functions almost like Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost. Charismatic, dangerous, compelling precisely because he represents the path the hero could have taken had he surrendered to bitterness rather than loyalty. What makes him fascinating is not his cruelty, but his familiarity. He is not an alien force, but a corrupted reflection. To me, this is always the most terrifying kind of antagonist. Not the stranger we fear, but the friend who becomes estranged, carrying with him the echo of what once was love. The dynamic between hero and villain here is less about ideology and more about personal history. Their battles feel weighted not only by present stakes, but by the invisible chain of memory. It reminded me of Brutus and Caesar, or Othello and Iago, relationships poisoned from within, where betrayal cuts deeper because it is sharpened by intimacy. Watching them face each other, I thought of old friendships that soured, the way a single fracture can transform affection into bitterness. It is this human truth that elevates the antagonist from a simple obstacle into a haunting embodiment of the past that refuses to remain buried. There's also the rescued comrade, introduced dramatically in the opening. His character fascinates me because he straddles both worlds, the veterans and the new recruits. Freed from captivity, he re-enters the fold carrying both gratitude and resentment, eager to fight, yet marked by absence. He embodies the cost of time lost, the way imprisonment, literal or metaphorical, changes a person. In him, we see the danger of nostalgia, the belief that one can simply pick up where things left off, when in truth, the world has shifted in your absence. His struggle to reintegrate becomes a subtle commentary on belonging, on the difficulty of reclaiming a place that has already begun to evolve without you. And then there are the quieter presences, the supporting figures who slip in and out of the narrative but serve as moral anchors. They're the ones who remind the hero of what truly matters, who push against his despair, who offer encouragement or challenge at crucial moments. Though they may not dominate the screen, their presence is vital. They are the chorus, the voice of conscience, the gentle reminder that even the strongest need grounding. In literature, these are often the nurse in Romeo and Juliet or Horatio in Hamlet, secondary figures whose loyalty stabilizes the chaos around them. What binds all these characters together is not just action, but relationship. This is at its core a story about bonds, how they fray, how they mend, how they endure. The veteran's loyalty, the recruit's eagerness, the antagonist's betrayal. All of it revolves around the central question of what it means to belong to one another. For me, that question resonates far beyond cinema. It makes me think of families, of friendships, of classrooms, of the communities we stitch together in our lives. These characters, though drawn in broad strokes, remind us of the fundamental truth that identity is not forged in isolation, but in the crucible of relationship. The leader is only a leader because others follow. The veterans are only veterans because they have endured together. The recruits only matter because their future intersects with the past. Even the antagonist carries meaning because he once shared the same bond he now seeks to destroy. Each character, then, is a fragment of a larger mosaic, and it is only when we step back that the full picture emerges. The arc of these figures converges in the climactic reconciliation, when old and new stand side by side, when loyalty is reaffirmed, when even failure becomes part of growth. In that moment, the leader recognizes that his burden is not his alone. The recruits learn that hubris is no substitute for wisdom, and the veterans accept that legacy is not an erasure, but a continuation. Each character grows not in isolation, but through their entanglement with one another. What stays with me most is the tenderness hidden within the rough exterior of these men. Beneath the explosions and bravado, their actions whisper of love, love for comrades, love for loyalty, love for the shared journey. They tease one another, they argue, they push back, but when danger rises, they stand shoulder to shoulder. That, I think, is what makes them resonate with me. It is not their invincibility, but their vulnerability. It is not their perfection, but their persistence. In the end, these characters are less mythic gods than weary mortals who refuse to let go of one another. They are flawed, scarred, occasionally foolish but steadfast. And in them, I see reflections of all of us. The way we stumble, the way we cling to those who matter, the way we fight not just for survival, but for belonging. That is why they linger in memory long after the credits roll. Because beneath the spectacle, beneath the roar of machinery and gunfire, they tell us the oldest story of all, that we are nothing alone and everything together. I remember first stumbling across some of these anecdotes not long after the film's release, tucked away in interviews, whispered through fan forums, embedded in DVD commentaries. They struck me because they felt like miniature stories in their own right, moments where the actors and crew were as much characters as the heroes they portrayed. If you imagine the film as one novel, then the production history is its companion piece, less polished perhaps, but sometimes even more revealing. One of the strangest facts is that the film was never meant to be quite as crowded as it became. The very concept of assembling such a pantheon of action legends was itself unprecedented. But with this installment, the producers went further, inviting an almost dizzying array of names. The casting process was like flipping through the mythology of Hollywood, calling on gods and demigods of muscle and grit. Yet what fascinates me is how many said yes. Think of that. In a world where egos often clash and schedules rarely align, somehow all these titans agreed to share the stage. It felt, to me, a little like reading about the Council of the Gods in Homer, each deity descending to earth to meddle in human affairs. And behind the scenes, the negotiations were just as mythic. Phone calls across continents, contracts rewritten overnight, promises made and broken, a delicate balancing act of money, prestige, and pride. But with such density of star power came unusual tensions. There are stories of actors jockeying for screen time, negotiating how many punches they could throw or how their characters should be portrayed. Some even had clauses written into their contracts specifying how badly they could or could not lose a fight. Can you imagine? In literature, we might call it authorial control, characters resisting the narrative, but here it was literal, men insisting their on-screen image remain unblemished. It's strange, and yet so deeply human. Even legends fear being overshadowed. Then there were the injuries. It almost reads like a tragicomic play. During filming, several of the actors sustained real wounds. Not the stage bruises of makeup, but torn muscles, broken bones, slipped discs. One actor suffered a back injury, so severe it required surgery. Another endured partial burns during an effects sequence gone wrong. The irony is that these men had built their reputations on playing invincible heroes, yet the production reminded us of their mortality. To me, that's almost poetic. The very bodies that once defied time and gravity, now faltering under its weight. Behind every explosion we saw on screen was another, quieter explosion in reality. The wear and tear of age clashing with the demands of spectacle. What deepens the strangeness is how some of these injuries were shrugged off. One actor, after sustaining a broken bone, returned to the set almost immediately, as though refusing to acknowledge weakness. I find that both admirable and haunting. It speaks to the same theme the film itself wrestles with: the refusal to accept limits, the insistence on pushing forward despite the toll. Literature often frames this as tragic hubris, the hero who cannot recognize his own vulnerability. Here, it played out not in myth, but in flesh. Another fact that fascinates me: the film was originally planned for a much harsher rating. Early drafts and even early cuts leaned into the grit, the violence, the blood. But then, in an effort to broaden the audience, a decision was made to tone it down, to aim for accessibility rather than intensity. This sparked debate, both on set and among fans. Some actors reportedly felt betrayed, believing the raw edge had been dulled, while others accepted it as a practical necessity. To me, this shift feels almost allegorical, like a grizzled poet deciding to temper his work for a new generation of readers. There is always tension between authenticity and accessibility, between remaining true to one's essence and adapting for survival. Even stranger than the rating debate was the security breach. Shortly before release, a high-quality copy of the film leaked online, downloaded millions of times before it ever hit theaters. This piracy scandal was not just a footnote. It altered the film's trajectory, impacting its box office performance and igniting lawsuits. Imagine laboring for months under grueling conditions, only to have your creation snatched and scattered across the digital ether before the curtains even rose. There's something almost Shakespearean in that betrayal, a Macbethian twist of fate where ambition collides with treachery. And yet, I can't help but marvel at the irony. A film about expendable warriors undone by an invisible, modern foe. Among the strangest occurrences was the presence of new actors who had never been part of this mythos before. Some were drawn from entirely different genres: comedy, drama, even wrestling, folded into the ensemble like unexpected ingredients in an old recipe. Their inclusion was both surprising and controversial, raising eyebrows among purists, but delighting those who longed for novelty. I think of it as a literary technique, inserting a jester into a tragedy or a philosopher into a comedy. It unsettles the rhythm, forcing the narrative to stretch in new directions. That kind of disruption is, in its own way, refreshing. And then there's the curious story of an actor who turned down the role. Several high-profile names were approached. Some even signed preliminary agreements, only to back away at the last minute. Reasons range from scheduling conflicts to discomfort with the ensemble format. But the whispers suggest deeper motives: fear of being lost in the crowd, or perhaps an unwillingness to cede the spotlight. These absences are as telling as the presences. Like characters cut from an early draft of a novel, they haunt the story's edges, reminding us of what might have been. What fascinates me most, though, are the small, human moments tucked between the explosions. Reports of the actors, many of them well past middle age, gathering together between takes to swap stories, laugh, share meals. Men who once defined rival studios and competing franchises, now sitting side by side, reminiscing about the absurdities of fame, the toll of stunts, the strange intimacy of decades in the public eye. These scenes, invisible to the camera, feel like the true heart of the production, a kind of quiet fellowship, as though the film itself was an excuse for old friends to gather. It reminds me of literary salons, where writers would come together not just to produce but to belong, to share their craft with those who understood its costs. There are also tales of practical absurdities: props malfunctioning, vehicles stalling mid-scene, pyrotechnics misfiring at the worst possible moment. One particularly chaotic day reportedly ended with an explosion larger than intended, shaking windows miles away. No one was hurt, but the incident became part of the production's lore, retold with equal parts humor and relief. I think of it like marginalia in a manuscript. Those little slips of ink or smudges that make the text more alive precisely because it is imperfect. Even the choice of locations carried strangeness. The film shot in Eastern Europe, where entire towns were transformed into battlegrounds. For local residents, The production was both a nuisance and a spectacle. Streets blocked off, skies lit with artificial fire, aging action stars wandering through cafes between takes. I imagined the surreal sight, stepping out to buy groceries only to see a convoy of armored vehicles rumbling past, followed by men who had once been posters on your childhood bedroom wall. Another unusual detail lies in the music. The score, while built on action tropes, drew inspiration from symphonic traditions, weaving motifs that echoed the ensemble nature of the cast. If one listens closely, there are layers, quiet strings beneath brass fanfares, that hint at vulnerability beneath the swagger. It's a subtlety many overlook, but for me, it deepens the experience. In literature, we often speak of subtext. Here, the music serves that role, whispering truths the dialogue never admits. One cannot forget the marketing quirks. The promotional campaign leaned heavily into nostalgia, plastering posters with iconic faces, some almost unrecognizable beneath age, but still carrying the aura of invincibility. Interviews became less about the plot and more about the meta-story, what it meant for these legends to gather, what it said about cinema itself. At times it felt as though the marketing was reviewing the film before critics even had a chance, shaping perception as much as selling tickets. That self-awareness, bordering on parody, was both strange and fascinating, as though the film existed as much in conversation about itself as in the story it told. And then, of course, the reception. Critics were divided, audiences were split, yet beneath the discourse one sensed a shared amazement that the film existed at all. It was less a movie than an event, a phenomenon that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, stitched together by nostalgia, spectacle, and sheer audacity. In that sense, the strangest fact of all might be the simplest, that this improbable gathering, with all its chaos and contradictions, happened, that so many egos aligned, that so many accidents were survived, that the story reached its end despite every obstacle. That itself feels miraculous. When I think back on all these behind-the-scenes oddities, the injuries, the leaks, the rivalries, the unexpected friendships, I see them as extensions of the story itself. The film told us about aging warriors refusing to yield, about loyalty strained and reforged. And the production echoed those themes in reality. Aging actors pushing their bodies beyond reason, betrayals through piracy, loyalty and friendships rekindled on set. It's as though art and life blurred, each reflecting the other in uncanny symmetry. And perhaps that's the ultimate strange fact. Not any single accident or decision, but the way the production embodied the very themes it dramatized. The line between fiction and reality collapsed. And in that collapse, we glimpsed something oddly profound. These men were not just pretending to fight against time. They were fighting it in reality. They were not just acting out camaraderie. They were rediscovering it. They were not just staging betrayals. They were living through them. So when I recall the strangest facts about this film, I don't think first of contracts or explosions or lawsuits. I think of the sight of old warriors laughing together between takes, of bodies breaking and mending, of stories spilling from men who had lived larger-than-life lives. That, for me, is stranger and richer than any spectacle on the screen. The reminder that behind every myth is a human story, flawed, fragile, and infinitely fascinating. There's a moment when I sit down with films like this, where the screen is dark, and I know that I am about to be led into something noisy, fiery, and unapologetically excessive. And yet, when I look back on it with the eyes of someone who loves literature, I don't see only the explosions and fight choreography. What stays with me, what I want to share with you now, are the quiet truths hidden inside those loud events, the deeper meanings that pulse beneath the spectacle. Because even the most chaotic of action films, when viewed through a critical lens, can become a mirror reflecting back our oldest stories and our deepest fears. One of the earliest events that strikes me with critical weight is the rescue mission that opens the story. On the surface, it's a classic trope, a daring operation, a team of hardened warriors storming enemy lines to liberate one of their own. It's fast, it's violent, and it's thrilling. But if you slow down and look at it critically, you see a ritual. This is not just action, it's initiation. In literary terms, the rescue is symbolic of renewal, a reaffirmation of the group's identity. Every shot fired, every wall blown open, becomes a reminder that the bonds between these men are not professional arrangements, but sacred pacts. I remember watching that sequence and feeling like I was reading the opening stanza of an epic poem, where the chorus reintroduces us to heroes we already know but need to see tested again. And that's what it does. It tells us without a single line of dialogue that loyalty and fraternity are at the core of this tale. Then, almost immediately, the narrative pivots to loss. The team suffers a devastating setback, and the emotional weight lingers. For me, this is where the film slips into something more profound than mere action. Critics often dismiss such moments as formulaic, but I think of them as crucial. They puncture the myth of invulnerability. In tragedies, death is never just about the fallen. It's about those left behind, forced to confront mortality. Watching these grizzled veterans reckon with that fragility made me think of Shakespeare's histories, where kings in their final acts face the erosion of their power, their armies, their very sense of self. This cinematic loss becomes a metaphor for aging, for irrelevance, for the painful realization that no band of brothers can remain untouched forever. From a critical perspective, the introduction of the younger recruits that follows is equally significant. At first glance, it looks like a studio decision. Inject fresh faces, appeal to a new generation. But dig deeper, and it becomes a generational parable. The old guard, bruised and haunted, steps aside, reluctantly acknowledging that their time may be waning. They scout for successors not out of pure strategy, but out of existential necessity. In literary terms, this is the handing over of the torch, the passing of the epic from one age to another. And what fascinates me is how uneasy it feels. The film doesn't portray this handoff as graceful or noble. It's fraught, bitter, tinged with resentment. I couldn't help but think of Tennyson's Ulysses, where the aging king laments his fading strength, but refuses to yield entirely. These warriors are the same. They see the need for change, but their souls resist it. The midpoint of the story is dominated by betrayal. And betrayal, in art, is never just a twist. It's the breaking of a covenant. Here, the betrayal reveals not only the fragility of the team's plans, but also the fragility of trust itself. Critically, it becomes the axis on which the entire film turns, shifting the tone from adventure to tragedy. I see it as a modern reworking of the archetypal Judas moment, the wound from within that hurts more than any enemy's bullet. And the emotional resonance lies in its inevitability. We know betrayal is coming. We sense it in the tension of earlier scenes, but when it happens, it still cuts deep. That, to me, is the mark of effective storytelling. It delivers what you expect, but in a way that still feels shocking. There's another layer here too, the villain. His reveal is not just the introduction of a new antagonist, but a ghost from the past. Critically, this is brilliant, because it forces the heroes to face not only a present threat, but the echoes of their own history. The villain becomes an embodiment of guilt and unfinished business. In literary terms, he is the revenant, the figure who returns to remind the living of what they cannot escape. Every confrontation with him is layered with history, and the audience feels that weight even if they can't articulate it. I remember watching those exchanges and feeling as though the past itself had been weaponized, turning nostalgia into a blade. The critical question becomes, why does this matter? Why should we, as lovers of literature and meaning, care about explosions dressed up as metaphors? The answer, I think, is that spectacle is never just spectacle. These events are the medium through which timeless ideas are explored. The younger team being captured, for instance, is not just a plot device. It is an allegory of hubris. They stride into danger, thinking their youth and technology will save them, only to be humbled. It's Oedipus blinding himself. It's Icarus flying too close to the sun. Their fall is a necessary reminder that strength without wisdom is fragility disguised as power. And then comes the turning point, the decision of the old warriors to return. For me, this is the heart of the film. They refuse to abandon their replacements, even though doing so would be easier and safer. From a critical perspective, this event transforms the narrative from tragedy into redemption. It tells us that legacy is not about leaving others to fend for themselves, but about guiding them, sacrificing for them, standing beside them even when the world says you're finished. I saw in that decision echoes of King Lear. The recognition that power means little without responsibility, that love expressed through action is the only true immortality. The climactic battle that follows is, on the surface, a storm of bullets and fire. But viewed critically, it is ritual combat, the old and the new fighting together, side by side, not to prove who is stronger, but to prove that unity transcends generational divides. I thought of Homer's Iliad, where warriors of different ages and lineages stood together on the plain of Troy, their individual stories converging into a collective epic. This final confrontation becomes less about victory over an enemy and more about reconciliation, with each other, with time, with fate itself. One of the most powerful critical perspectives comes from the aftermath. When the dust settles, what lingers is not triumph but relief. The heroes do not strut, they exhale. And in that exhale, we feel the truth. Survival itself is victory. Literature has long wrestled with this theme, the recognition that endurance, not conquest, defines the human spirit. Whether in ancient epics or modern novels, the quiet aftermath is often more important than the noise of battle. Here, too, the subdued resolution resonates more deeply than any explosion. As for its impact and reception, critics often saw only the surface, a loud, crowded action film that sometimes stumbled under its own weight. But audiences, particularly those who grew up with these legends, felt something deeper. They saw in those events reflections of their own aging, their own longing for relevance, their own fears of obsolescence. That's the film's true resonance. It is not about guns or grenades, but about time, memory, and the unyielding need to belong. When I revisit these significant events with the eyes of someone who loves literature, I no longer see a series of set pieces strung together by plot mechanics. I see myth, tragedy, redemption, and allegory woven through spectacle. I see a meditation on mortality disguised as entertainment. And perhaps that's the greatest critical insight. The film succeeds not because it avoids cliches, but because it embraces them, transforms them, and lets them echo like ancient stories retold for a new age. So, yes, the explosions roar, the villains sneer, the heroes strike impossible poses. But beneath it all, these events are about us, about our struggles to stay relevant, our grief at what we lose, our stubborn refusal to yield, and our desperate hope that, even in our final battles, we might still stand together. And isn't that, in the end, the most human story of all? There's something irresistible about peeking behind the curtain of filmmaking. We sit in the theater, or perhaps on our couch at home, and we see the finished product. The roaring helicopters, the gleaming weapons, the sparks flying from collapsing walls. But the truth is, those images are born of sweat, laughter, missteps, and serendipity. Moments where crew members problem solved in the dark, where actors told old war stories between takes, where the air smelled not of gunpowder, but of burned coffee and rain-soaked costumes. And when I think about this particular film, I realize the stories behind the screen are often just as thrilling as the fictional battles themselves. The production was, by all accounts, a spectacle in its own right. Imagine corralling a cast that reads like an encyclopedia of action cinema, each one a personality larger than life, each one carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood. From the very beginning, the challenge wasn't only about explosions or stunts. It was about balance. How do you let each star shine without dimming the others? For me, that's where the film starts to feel almost Shakespearean behind the camera. a stage where titans of different eras must learn to share space. The director became something like a conductor of a chaotic orchestra, trying to coax harmony from instruments that refuse to play quietly. One of my favorite stories from a set is about the sheer unpredictability of working with such veterans. These were not young newcomers willing to be molded. They were legends who knew their craft, who had their own ways of doing things, and who weren't afraid to say no. There were times when entire scenes had to be reblocked on the spot because one actor decided he didn't like the angle or another thought the stunt could be done bigger. And instead of tension, what often came out of these disagreements was humor. Imagine a dozen icons, all with scars and stories of their own, good-naturedly arguing about who should kick down the door first. It's the kind of image that makes me smile, because it reminds me that even heroes of the screen are still people trying to negotiate ego, pride, and friendship. Of course, no production of this scale comes without its bruises, literally. The film was notorious for its injuries. Bones were broken, ligaments torn, and stitches were practically part of the costume department. One actor reportedly fractured his vertebrae during a stunt, while another found himself with a dislocated shoulder after a poorly timed move. And yet, rather than slowing things down, these injuries seemed to fuel the mythos. There's something oddly poetic about watching performers push their bodies beyond reason, refusing to let time dictate what they can or cannot do. It feels like a continuation of the themes in the story itself. Men fighting against age, against fragility, against inevitability. The line between fiction and reality blurred, and the set became a battlefield in its own right. But there were moments of levity, too. Between takes, the cast often swapped stories like campfire veterans. Tales of younger days, of wild productions in the 80s, of directors who screamed too much or stunts that nearly went wrong. For someone who loves film history, those conversations would have been a goldmine. They reveal that behind the facade of bulletproof machismo lies a fraternity built on shared experiences. The late nights, the absurd costumes, the unrelenting grind of Hollywood. In that sense, the behind-the-scenes stories carry the same resonance as the film's themes. Brotherhood forged through trial and error. The locations themselves tell a story. Shot largely in Eastern Europe, the production brought Hollywood spectacle to streets and buildings that carried their own scars of history. There's something haunting about seeing explosions rip through old stone structures, places that once bore witness to real struggles and wars. For the crew, this setting was both an opportunity and a challenge. Logistically, it meant navigating unfamiliar terrain, dealing with weather that seemed to turn on a dime, and coordinating with local authorities to shut down areas that were not accustomed to Hollywood mayhem. But critically, it also added texture. You can feel in the final images that the walls and streets are not mere sets. They have weight, age, memory. And the production team leaned into that, allowing the history of the place to seep into the story. One of the strangest production facts is tied to the film's budget. Despite being one of the most star-packed ensembles in action history, the budget constraints were surprisingly tight. At times, this meant corners had to be cut in ways you might not expect. Wardrobe was sometimes recycled, props were refurbished rather than built from scratch, and digital effects teams often had to find creative solutions rather than expensive ones. And yet, this limitation gave the film a rugged charm. It reminded me of the way older action films had to innovate with what they had: duct tape, smoke machines, and sheer imagination. In a world where CGI often erases the grit, these constraints kept things tangible. And speaking of CGI, here lies another fascinating truth. So much of what you see on screen is practical. Yes, digital effects played their part, but many of the explosions, crashes, and stunts were executed in reality. Cars really flipped, walls really blew apart, sparks really flew. For the crew, this was both exhilarating and terrifying. Imagine standing behind a camera as fireballs erupt 30 feet away, knowing you've only got one take to get it right. I think about the courage not only of the actors, but of the stunt coordinators, pyrotechnics teams, and camera operators who willingly put themselves in the line of controlled chaos. Their work rarely gets the spotlight, but without them, the spectacle would be hollow. There's also something deeply endearing about the camaraderie between the crew and cast. These productions are not just about the stars. They're about the hundreds of people who haul cables, set lights, and sweep debris after each explosion. Stories emerge of cast members staying late to help reset scenes, or of actors sharing meals with the crew in makeshift tents during long night shoots. These details matter because they humanize the legends. They remind us that film is a collaborative art, and even the most iconic figures are part of a larger family, bound together by exhaustion and caffeine and the unshakable desire to finish the day's work. Another unusual anecdote that always sticks with me is the infamous casting process. The film was designed to be a grand reunion of action legends, and the negotiations to bring each one aboard were legendary in themselves. Some were easy yes answers. Others required months of persuasion, schedules being rearranged, or personal favors being called in. And there were names that didn't make it in, actors who were approached but declined, or who wanted to join but couldn't because of other commitments. For fans, those missing faces became almost mythological, whispers of what could have been. In a sense, the production stories about who didn't show up are just as fascinating as those about who did. And then there's the curious case of the film's leak. Long before its official release, a near-perfect copy made its way online, downloaded millions of times before opening weekend. For the production, it was a disaster. For critics and fans, it became part of the film's lore. It felt like another echo of the story itself. Outsiders infiltrating, stealing what belonged to the team, throwing everything into chaos. While financially damaging, the leak only added to the mythos, turning the film into a sort of underdog that had to fight not only box office rivals, but piracy itself. All of these production insights remind me that cinema is never just about the story we see. It's about the story of making the story. It's about actors with taped-up knees who refuse to quit, directors who juggle egos like live grenades, crews who risk their safety to capture fleeting moments of magic. When I peel back the curtain and look at these behind-the-scenes tales, I find a kind of meta-narrative. The film is about warriors fighting impossible odds, and the making of it was the same. Both are epics, both are messy, both are deeply human. And maybe that's the fun of it all. The trivia, the little-known details, the oddities, they're not just random facts. They're pieces of a puzzle that make the final picture richer. Knowing that an actor performed a stunt with a fractured rib, or that a scene was rewritten on set because someone told a better joke, changes the way you watch. It turns the film into a palimpsest, where beneath the visible images lie faint traces of the struggle it took to bring them alive. When I share these stories with friends who love literature, I often say, treat the production as its own text. Read the injuries as metaphors for resilience, the budget constraints as metaphors for creativity under duress, the casting negotiations as metaphors for the impossibility of uniting so many egos under one banner. Suddenly, the fun facts aren't trivial. They're insights into how art survives despite chaos. And perhaps that is the greatest story of all. Not the one told on screen, but the one lived behind it. When I think back on this film, it isn't just the faces of the actors or the thunder of gunfire that come to mind. It's the spaces they inhabit. The setting, to me, has always felt like a character in its own right, shaping the mood, guiding the tension, whispering its presence even in the quietest moments. I've always believed that settings in cinema operate like stage directions in theater. They don't simply hold the action, they define it, constrain it, and ultimately give it meaning. And in this particular story, the places feel almost haunted by history, as though each wall and bridge carries scars of its own. What's remarkable is the way the filmmakers used real locations instead of relying purely on constructed sets or digital backdrops. Much of the story unfolds across Eastern European landscapes, urban blocks with their peeling paint, their concrete austerity, their faint echoes of old regimes. I remember the first time I saw those streets on screen, I thought of photographs of post-war cities, functional, battered, yet strangely resilient. There's a certain honesty in those bricks and stones, a refusal to hide behind glossy facades. And that honesty bleeds into the story itself, grounding it, refusing to let the spectacle float away into unreality. The decision to stage explosive battles within such settings strikes me as deliberate. On one hand, the contrast is exhilarating. Ancient buildings suddenly illuminated by fire, quiet courtyards transformed into battlefields. On the other, it feels symbolic. These old places, with their worn facades and silent histories, stand as metaphors for the characters themselves. Seasoned, scarred, yet unyielding. When I watch a crumbling stone wall absorb the shock of grenade, I can't help but think about the actors whose bodies, too, carry the residue of decades of battles, on screen and in life. The setting is a mirror, reflecting the story's deeper truths without ever speaking a word. One particular location that stays in my mind is the sprawling industrial compound where some of the most tense sequences unfold. There's something eerie about industrial ruins. The rusting pipes, the echo of footsteps on metal catwalks, the way shafts of light cut through dust-filled air. These places are neither fully alive nor fully abandoned, and that liminality makes them perfect for cinematic tension. I think of T.S. Eliot's line about hollow men in a valley of dying stars, and that's what these places evoke. A landscape caught between vitality and decay, where violence feels both inevitable and tragic. The cinematography amplifies this atmosphere. Notice how often the camera lingers in wide shots, allowing us to take in not just the fighters but the vastness of the world around them. The characters are framed against sweeping backdrops, skylines, rivers, endless skies, as if to remind us that even the most hardened warriors are dwarfed by the world. At times the lens pulls in tight, capturing sweat, dust, and the flicker of doubt in an eye. This rhythm of expansion and contraction, wide to narrow, vast to intimate, mirrors the emotional beats of the story. It reminds us that battles are both cosmic and personal, that explosions may shake cities, but the real war happens in a single heartbeat. I've always been fascinated by the film's use of color. So much of the palette is muted, grays, browns, deep greens. These aren't the polished neons of comic book blockbusters. They're the colors of earth and stone, of uniforms washed too many times, of skies heavy with weather. This restraint lends the film a kind of gravitas. But then when fire bursts or sparks scatter, the contrast feels shocking, almost beautiful. It's as if the film withholds brightness so that when it does arrive, it burns itself into your memory. There's a kind of literary irony there. The mundanity of muted tones suddenly pierced by moments of brilliance, like rare metaphors in a prose text that otherwise remains plain-spoken. One sequence I often return to in my mind involves a bridge, both literal and metaphorical. Bridges in literature always signify transition, danger, or the crossing of boundaries. And here, the choice of shooting on an actual stone bridge, weathered and narrow, heightens that resonance. The camera angles emphasize both the precariousness of the structure and the courage required to charge across it under fire. I couldn't help but think of Homeric warriors crossing thresholds into enemy lands or Shakespeare's soldiers rallying on vulnerable ground. The setting transforms what might have been a straightforward firefight into something layered with archetypal meaning. What fascinates me is how often the film uses verticality. Characters descend into underground spaces, climb through skeletal buildings, or perch atop towers. The vertical movement is never arbitrary. It seems to suggest the constant struggle between falling and rising, between collapse and transcendence. The cinematography plays with this by emphasizing low angles when characters are defiant and high, looming shots when they are vulnerable. The spaces themselves demand this movement. Stairs, ladders, crumbling facades. And in doing so, the setting dictates the choreography of the story. Another detail that enriches the film's atmosphere is its use of weather. You'll notice moments when the sky darkens ominously, when rain slicks the streets, when wind whips through broken windows. These aren't just accidents of shooting schedules. They're part of the texture of the world. Rain makes the ground treacherous, mud stains clothing, thunder echoes like distant artillery. The weather participates in the drama, heightening it. I've always thought of weather in film as a form of silent dialogue between the world and the characters, and here it feels particularly pointed. It suggests that nature itself has grown weary of violence, that even the sky participates in the story's exhaustion. The use of interiors also carries weight. Dilapidated rooms, dimly lit hideouts, makeshift headquarters. These are not glamorous spaces. The cinematography often lets the shadows dominate, leaving only slivers of light across faces or weapons. In literature, shadows are always about ambiguity, about what is hidden, about the unknown forces lurking just beyond sight. Here, the interiors feel claustrophobic, as though the walls themselves are closing in on the characters. And yet, these are also spaces of camaraderie, rooms where plans are whispered, where old friends exchange knowing looks. The duality of safety and suffocation makes these interiors deeply resonant. Perhaps the most profound element of the setting, for me, is its silence. Amid the explosions and gunfire, there are moments when the world seems to hold its breath. The quiet of a forest before dawn, the stillness of a hallway, just before boots thunder through it. These pauses matter because they remind us that space is not just physical, but emotional. Silence allows us to feel the gravity of what is about to come. It creates anticipation, a vacuum waiting to be filled by chaos. Without those silences, the noise would lose its meaning. It's easy to forget how much thought goes into a single shot. The placement of the camera, the direction of light, the decision to hold an image for 3 seconds instead of 2. Cinematography is, in a way, a form of poetry written in light. And in this film, that poetry is one of contrasts, stillness and chaos, shadow and flame, ruin and resilience. The settings are not backdrops, but lines in that poem, giving rhythm and texture to the larger story. I've sometimes wondered how different the film would feel if shot on glossy Hollywood sets rather than in weathered Eastern landscapes. I suspect it would lose much of its weight. Glossy sets might have looked impressive, but they wouldn't have carried the same scars, the same whispers of history. And without those whispers, the story would risk becoming hollow spectacle. By rooting itself in places that feel lived in, scarred, and real, the film maintains its tether to something larger than entertainment. It ties itself to memory, to history, to the idea that battles always unfold in places already marked by other battles. When I reflect on the use of setting here, I realize that it mirrors how literature treats landscape. Think of Hardy's moors, or Hemingway's Spanish hillsides, or even the anonymous towns of Kafka. The landscape is never neutral. It always presses on the characters, shaping their fates. This film understands that truth, even if unconsciously. Its settings don't just hold the action. They define the kind of action that can take place, and they comment silently on what that action means. And maybe that's why, after the credits roll, it's not only the faces or lines I remember, but the textures. The crack of old stone, the gleam of steel under gray skies, the silhouette of men against firelit ruins. These images linger like verses from a poem, not because they tell us what happened, but because they remind us how it felt. And in the end, that is the power of cinematic setting. Not to be noticed as scenery, but to be felt as atmosphere, as mood, as truth. What I've always loved most about cinema isn't just what happens on screen, but the invisible stories humming beneath it. The unseen hours, the friendships struck under glaring lights, the mistakes and miracles that shape what finally reaches us in the darkened theater. It's in those fragile, fleeting moments behind the camera where movies take their true shape. Watching this particular film for the first time, I remember thinking, what must it have been like to wrangle a cast so large, so iconic, and so combustible? And in that wondering, I began to imagine, and later to discover, that the making of the movie was almost as dramatic, chaotic, and surprisingly tender as the story it set out to tell. What struck me first in learning about the shoot was how much of it hinged on timing, on gathering actors who themselves carried decades of screen history. Imagine the logistics. Not just one star, but a constellation, each orbiting with their own schedules, obligations, egos, and fragilities. It felt less like assembling a cast and more like orchestrating a reunion of gladiators, each scarred, each proud, and yet all willing to step back into the arena one more time. The producers joked, I once read, that securing each actor was like coaxing a lion back into the ring. Not because they resisted, but because they demanded space, recognition, respect. And yet, once on set, those lions remembered they were part of the same pride. I've always been fascinated by how camaraderie develops on sets, especially when egos could so easily clash. There were stories of laughter breaking out between takes, old warhorses ribbing each other like schoolboys. I picture them, leaning against prop crates, telling stories not just about movies, but about life, trading injuries like soldiers comparing scars. There is something deeply human in that image. Icons stripped of their myth. Men simply sharing time together, joking about aching knees, about stunt mishaps from decades past, about how strange it felt to be doing it all again after so many years. Of course, it wasn't all easy laughter. The challenges of filming such a mammoth production were immense. There were reports of accidents on set, one tragic, another merely painful but disruptive. Those moments must have cast shadows over the crew, reminders that no matter how choreographed a scene might be, risk is always real. I imagine the hush that must have fallen after such moments, the sobering recognition that behind every explosion or daring leap was a human body, fragile despite all the bravado. And yet, from those challenges, a renewed determination often rose. Crew members adapted safety measures, stunts were revised, and in an odd way, those hardships bonded the team even closer. One of my favorite little details is how many of the actors refused to step back from stunts, despite their age and the risks involved. There's something stubborn, almost poetic, about watching veterans insist on feeling the rush themselves rather than handing it to doubles. Some might call it recklessness, but I see it as authenticity, a need to prove not to the audience, but to themselves that they still carried fire in their veins. Behind the scenes, I imagine the director shaking his head, both grateful and anxious, as yet another star insisted on taking a fall, rolling through an explosion, or sprinting across set when they could just as easily have let someone else absorb the shock. And then there's the cultural melting pot of the set itself. Filming across Eastern European locations meant working with local crews, often in places where language barriers tested patience, but also led to moments of humor. I can almost hear the mix of accents, American drawls mingling with Bulgarian inflections, British wit threading through the chaos. Film sets are small cities for the weeks they exist, and this one must have felt particularly vibrant, with